What you are about to hear will change the way you look at classic cinema. These 11 British legends lived inside a carefully constructed lie, and we believed every word they spoke. They lightened their skin, reshaped their accents, and for years performed passion for women, while behind closed doors an entirely different and unsettling reality waited for them. Pay special attention to the story of Merle Oberon, a woman who erased her origins and forced her own mother into silence to preserve the myth of pure blood. Watch until the end to understand how Hollywood shattered destinies in pursuit of a flawless image, and why the truth about these stars surfaced only after their deaths. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, should genius be forgiven for such monstrous deception?
Cary Grant. In the history of world cinema, no man embodied the idea of elegance more convincingly than Cary Grant. The immaculate parting of his hair, the sun-kissed glow that seemed eternal, and that unmistakable gaze where irony met quiet entitlement. He wore sophistication as if he had been born in silk. Yet if you had walked onto the set of the Philadelphia Story and called out his real name, Archibald Leach, that golden glow might well have drained from his face. The story of Cary Grant is not merely a rise to fame, it is the greatest act of self-erasure Hollywood has ever witnessed. To create the idol, Archibald had to commit a symbolic murder of himself, wiping away the poverty of Bristol and the sour scent of cheap ale. The world saw an aristocrat, a man seemingly born to privilege, but in truth, Grant was engineered from blueprints he sketched in childhood while hiding from the nightmare of his own reality. His father, Elias Leach, was a factory worker whose life was steeped in alcohol and quiet despair. His mother, Elsie, fragile and unraveling, simply vanished one day. 10-year-old Archie was told she had gone away to a seaside resort. Later, he was told she had died. In reality, his father had committed her to a psychiatric institution to make room for a new family. That lie became the bedrock on which Cary Grant was built. The world is a place where even those closest to you can betray you, and truth is something that can be rewritten. When Archibald arrived in Hollywood, the executives at Paramount quickly understood that the young man had presence, but his origins were dead weight. His Bristol accent grated on refined ears, and the biography of a drunkard's son did not fit the image of a leading man. What followed was a full-scale reconstruction. The studio hired the finest speech coaches to scour the working-class Briton out of him. In its place emerged the so-called mid-Atlantic accent, a linguistic invention spoken by no one in real life except millionaires in the movies and Cary Grant himself. It was a voice from nowhere, belonging to a man whose only homeland was the screen. Grant trained his walk, the way he held a glass, even the casual adjustment of his cuffs with obsessive precision. He turned his body into an instrument dedicated to maintaining the legend. The studio flooded the press with fabricated tales of his noble upbringing, while the actor himself spent staggering sums on psychotherapy and later experimented with LSD, desperately trying to locate the boy named Archie, buried beneath decades of performance. The paradox was cruel. The more convincingly Grant sold perfection, the more terrified he became of exposure. He lived in constant fear that some acquaintance from Bristol would step out of the shadows and point at the gleaming facade. Studio publicists operated like intelligence agencies. Any whisper about his harsh childhood or peculiarities in his private life was swiftly neutralized. In Hollywood, there were murmurs about his extreme frugality. Grant might send guests a bill for laundry or mark milk bottles to ensure the staff did not take more than their share. It was not simple stinginess. It was the fear of poverty Archie Leach had carried with him into the mansions of Beverly Hills. The industry helped him conceal not only his past, but the complexities of his nature. His marriages were presented as celestial unions, though inside them simmered storms and icy distance. Grant was so devoted to his image that even in intimacy he struggled to switch off the star. He became a hostage to his own perfection. In his 30s, he learned by chance that his mother was alive and had been institutionalized all those years. The revelation could have destroyed him if it had reached the papers. Hollywood star abandons mother in asylum. The studio and his agents ensured the story remained buried. He arranged for her release and supported her for the rest of her life, yet they remained strangers. She saw Cary Grant, the man from the screen. He saw a living reminder of the pain he had spent his life fleeing. Until his final days, he remained a man in a mask. Alfred Hitchcock, who adored Grant, once remarked that Cary was the only actor whose face could never be fully read. Behind the perfect symmetry, there was always something restless, something withheld. When Grant said, "I spent my whole life pretending to be Cary Grant, and in the end I became him," it was not playful modesty. It was a sentence pronounced on himself. He had created a character better, sharper, more beautiful than the frightened boy he once was, and the industry had eagerly helped him sell that illusion to the world. When he died in 1986, the public mourned a style icon. Few ever truly saw the terrified boy from Bristol who only wanted to be loved and who, for that love, agreed to disappear forever into the shadow of the great Cary Grant.
Laurence Olivier. If British theatre and cinema had a face, it would have been the face of Sir Laurence Olivier, a man whose jaw seemed carved from the white cliffs of Dover, whose voice could make stone weep over a line of Shakespeare. He was not merely an actor, he was an institution, a national treasure, the very standard of masculinity to which generations aspired. Yet behind the facade of the first night of the stage lay a life built on constant maneuvering, designed to conceal a truth that, in the middle of the 20th century, could have done more than ruin a career. It could have led to prosecution. Laurence Olivier was a master of disguise, and his greatest performance was that of an unassailable pillar of British heterosexual virtue. At a time when studio contracts contained clauses about moral conduct and homosexuality in Britain was a criminal offense, he had to build around himself a fortress of myth, marriages, and carefully orchestrated press adoration. The brightest brick in that wall was his union with Vivien Leigh. To the world, they were the king and queen of Hollywood and London alike, the perfect couple whose passion had flared on the set of Fire Over England and burned for decades. While publicists at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and the Rank organization churned out glossy photographs of their embraces, the truth behind closed doors was steeped in bitterness, instability, and a secret bearing the name Danny Kaye. Olivier's relationship with the American comedian Danny Kaye was one of the industry's most fiercely guarded secrets. It was no fleeting affair, but a profound, anguished, and passionate love that endured for 10 years. The contrast bordered on the surreal, the austere British knight, embodiment of Hamlet and Henry V, and the eccentric red-haired American famed for his comic patter and elastic expressions. They met in the 1940s, and the spark between them was so powerful that Olivier began leading a double life with astonishing dexterity. The industry knew. In London's theatre wings and at discreet Malibu gatherings, their relationship was discussed in lowered voices, yet not a single line found its way into print. Studio heads understood that Olivier was a premiere export, a symbol of British spirit. To tarnish him would have meant striking at the prestige of the entire empire.
So when Kaye flew to England and stayed at the estate Olivier shared with Leigh, it was presented to reporters as a friendly visit between colleagues. Vivien Leigh, herself struggling with severe mental illness, was forced to play the role of the devoted wife in this tragic drama, fully aware that her husband's heart belonged to the man who made children laugh from the screen. Olivier wielded his reputation as a serious actor like a shield. Who would dare suspect impropriety in the man who recited "to be or not to be" before the royal family? He cultivated an image of cool, disciplined professionalism, as though his private life were merely a backdrop to great art. Yet later biographers would recall how he seemed to come alive in Kaye's presence, how the mask of severity slipped to reveal someone vulnerable and uncertain. The studio helped maintain the divide between image and reality, arranging timely whispers of new romantic entanglements with women whenever rumors about Danny grew too loud. It was a classic strategy of distraction. Even as his marriage to Leigh fractured under the weight of her illness and his hidden attachments, the industry continued to sculpt them into a golden couple. The tragedy of perfect love sold better than the truth of a complicated and unhappy bond. Olivier's tragedy lay in becoming a prisoner of British exceptionalism itself. He felt bound to meet the expectations of a nation. His knighthood in 1947 was not only an honor, but a gilded cage. Every gesture was governed by an unspoken code. The studios used him as a symbol of high art to lend dignity to the commercial machinery of film, and in return he paid with silence. Even in his memoirs, written late in life, Olivier touched only lightly on his temptations, wrapping them in careful phrases that the perceptive could read between the lines. His family preserved that silence for decades, guarding the patriarch's legacy. Only after his death, when the world had grown marginally kinder towards human complexity, did fragments of truth begin to surface, in letters, in recollections of witnesses, in the quiet admissions of those close to him. Olivier lived as a grand palimpsest. Over his true feelings and desires, the bold script of a hero's biography had been inscribed. Until his final breath, he ensured that the lower layer would never be exposed to the crowd. He was a great actor, not only because of his brilliance on stage, but because he transformed his own life into a flawless, airtight fiction, one the entire world believed, save for the few who had seen him without grease paint in the hush of locked rooms.
Vivien Leigh. If Hollywood ever needed a living embodiment of a porcelain figurine, delicate, luminous, yet forged around a core of steel and a soul set ablaze, it found her in Vivien Leigh. To the world, she was the quintessential English rose, her features flawless, her aristocratic poise seemingly innate. But behind that radiant facade stood a woman whose life was split between the film set and the abyss into which her mind was slowly slipping, all under the indifferent gaze of studio executives. The tragedy of Vivien Leigh was this: her illness, bipolar disorder, then labeled manic depressive psychosis, became not a call for compassion, but a resource to be exploited. Producers quickly realized that her volatility, her frayed edges, lent her performances an unbearable authenticity no technique could manufacture. When Vivien dissolved into hysteria or sank into suffocating melancholy, David O. Selznick's publicists and the bosses at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer merely exchanged satisfied glances, praising her true star temperament and complete immersion in the role. To the world, she was Scarlett O'Hara, unbreakable, fierce. In reality, Vivien was a fragile vessel, cracking under the slightest strain, while Hollywood continued to pour molten lead into it in the form of relentless schedules. The system was merciless. During the filming of Gone with the Wind, Leigh was driven to work 16 to 18 hours a day, her nervous system fueled by endless cigarettes and punishing amounts of caffeine.
No one paused to ask why she was beginning to lose her grip on reality. When she burst into laughter without cause or locked herself in her trailer, sobbing in inexplicable terror, studio doctors handed her sedatives and pushed her back beneath the lights. The industry needed Lady Olivier, a style icon and the devoted wife of Britain's greatest actor. Any mention of psychiatric clinics or the electroconvulsive treatments Vivien underwent in secrecy under cover of night was strictly forbidden. The publicity machine polished the image of her marriage to Laurence Olivier until it gleamed, though in truth their home had long become a battlefield. In the throes of an episode, Vivien might lash out at her husband in fury, only to remember nothing an hour later. The studio knew everything. They knew about her memory lapses, about her reckless affairs that were not scandal, but symptoms of manic phases, about the tuberculosis she concealed for fear of losing roles. Yet instead of offering real treatment, they handed her new scripts, extracting the last reserves of her vitality for box office returns. Vivien Leigh's double life was an exhausting performance. In public, she had to be impeccable, witty, elegant, a living emblem of Britain on the world stage, but once the dressing room door closed, she became a frightened woman who no longer recognized herself. The boundary between Vivien and her heroines, Blanche Dubois in A Street Named Desire, Anna Karenina, thinned to transparency. Later, she would admit that Blanche pushed her closer to the brink than any role before it. The studio watched her fade, saw the unsettling light in her eyes that was no longer acting, but something raw and real, and the camera loved it. The industry concealed her illness not out of mercy, but out of fear. If audiences learned that their vision of beauty endured brutal treatments in private institutions, the magic would shatter. So the press was fed careful phrases, delicate health, exhaustion from overwork. Even when her behavior during filming in India became impossible to manage and she was replaced by Elephant Taylor in Elephant Walk, the official explanation remained a nervous breakdown due to the heat. Vivien Leigh was a hostage to her own perfection. She fought desperately to live up to the title of lady, suppressing her pain until it erupted in uncontrollable bursts of anger. The Hollywood studio system and the British theatrical establishment together built a vacuum around her. They isolated her from ordinary life, persuading her that her worth lay solely in her ability to transmit suffering onto the screen. She died at 53, alone, of tuberculosis, physically and emotionally exhausted. Yet even after her death, the industry guarded the legend. Memoirs by her contemporaries were carefully edited to preserve the myth of the English rose. The world was meant to remember her forever young, scarlet against a crimson sunset, not the worn woman whose mind had been scorched by treatment and turmoil, who until her last days waited for someone to look beyond the star's mask and see her wounded, human soul. Vivien Leigh became a casualty of a grand illusion in which the price of immortality in cinema was the sacrifice of truth.
Merle Oberon. The story of Merle Oberon is perhaps the most intricate and disciplined act of mystification the British film industry has ever witnessed. If Cary Grant merely altered his accent and manners, Merle was forced to rewrite her very DNA to survive in a world where purity of blood was valued above talent. The public knew her as an exquisite British lady, the Tasmanian Rose, born into an aristocratic family and swept onto the screen by chance. Her porcelain skin, almond-shaped eyes, and flawless poise made her the perfect Kathy in Wuthering Heights, a paragon of English femininity. Yet, behind that luminous facade lay a secret she guarded with the ferocity of a wounded animal. She was neither British by birth nor aristocratic, and her porcelain complexion was the result of dangerous treatments and the careful craft of lighting technicians. She had been born Estelle Merle O'Brien Thompson in Bombay to an Indian nurse of Maori and Ceylonese descent and a British engineer. In the era of colonial rule and rigid racial hierarchies in Hollywood and London, her origins were not merely an inconvenience, they were a career death sentence. To become a star, she did not simply lie, she erased her mother from her history, turning her into a shadow that would haunt her to the end. The studio machine of Alexander Korda, who would later become her husband, operated with surgical precision. A legend was devised. Merle had been born in Tasmania to respectable British parents, but all records of her birth had been destroyed in a devastating fire at the town hall. It was a brilliant fabrication, in those days nearly impossible to verify. Tasmania was distant and exotic enough to explain her unusual beauty, yet safely within the British Empire, granting her the necessary social standing. But Merle herself lived in a constant state of paranoia. She knew her skin carried a natural olive undertone that the camera might betray at any moment. She became obsessed with lightening it, resorting to hazardous mercury-based creams and layers of heavy makeup that eventually left her with severe dermatitis and chronic allergies. On set, she ruled the lighting like a tyrant. She demanded to be filmed only under carefully controlled conditions that would wash away any hint of her true ethnicity. Cinematographers cursed her temper and her endless adjustments, unaware that behind them lay not vanity, but a primal fear of exposure. The darkest element of this elaborate fiction, however, was her relationship with her mother, Charlotte. When Merle brought her, first to England and later to Hollywood, she faced an impossible dilemma. Charlotte looked unmistakably Indian, and her presence beside the Snow Queen of British cinema would have shattered the Tasmanian myth in an instant. The solution Merle and the studio devised was monstrous in its simplicity. Her mother was introduced to the public as her maid. Later, when their resemblance became too obvious to dismiss, the story was altered. Her mother became her sister. A mother was forced to live in the shadows, obedient to the rules of a brutal game in which her mere existence threatened her daughter's success. At public receptions, she silently carried drinks or stood at a distance, while Merle sparkled in diamonds, recounting tales of imaginary aristocratic ancestors. The industry knew of the strange servant, but it asked no questions as long as Merle generated profit and embodied British elegance. The lie seeped into every corner of her life. Even her husbands, including the powerful Alexander Korda, were either complicit in the conspiracy of silence or deceived by it. Merle inhabited the role so completely that she seemed at times to believe in her own Tasmanian birth. She visited Tasmania only once, already a global star, and it was among the most agonizing episodes of her life. The local press clamored for details about their celebrated native daughter, while Merle, pale with fear, responded in vague generalities, terrified she might contradict the very biography she had invented. The studio continued to shield her, creating a vacuum around the actress through which no fragment of truth from India could penetrate. Her life became a relentless walk through a minefield, each new film reinforcing the lie, each interview carrying the risk of total ruin. The truth began to surface only after her death in 1979. Biographers traveling to India and Tasmania discovered that the burned archives were a myth, and in Bombay they found records of a girl born to Charlotte Selina Thompson. Even the engineer father had been part of a more complicated family drama, simplified for Hollywood consumption. Yet there was a bitter irony in it all. Merle Oberon, who had struggled so desperately to pass as purely British, entered history as the first actress of Asian descent to be nominated for an Academy Award. She shattered that ceiling, but at the cost of her own name, her face, and her bond with her mother. The industry helped her conceal her Indian roots because Hollywood of that era was not prepared to accept a star of a different color. Merle accepted those rules and played by them. She became a great actress, not only on screen, but in life itself, performing until her final breath the role of a woman who had never truly existed.
Ian McKellen. Today, Sir Ian McKellen is seen as the living embodiment of wisdom, integrity, and absolute inner freedom. We know him as Gandalf, beard streaming in the wind, or as Magneto, whose gaze seems capable of bending steel. Yet few stop to consider that this symbol of British dignity spent nearly half a century suspended in a painful split between his public persona and his true self. McKellen's story is not merely a private confession, it is a chronicle of collective hypocrisy, an industry and a nation that for decades demanded their finest sons perform the role of proper Englishmen while suffocating in the shadows of their own closets. In the Britain of his youth, homosexuality was not just a social stigma, but a criminal offense, punishable by imprisonment. For a young actor honing his craft on Shakespearean stages, admitting his orientation would have meant instant professional suicide. The London theater world, and certainly Hollywood, operated under an unspoken rule: we all know who you are, but if you dare to say it aloud, we will destroy you. Ian McKellen accepted those terms. For 49 years, he mastered the art of a double life. His career was studded with monumental roles, yet each one also served as camouflage. When he played Romeo or Hamlet, audiences saw the quintessential classical hero, and the industry protected that image with quiet vigilance. Producers and impresarios understood that a certain segment of the audience would not flock to see a gay man in tights, so any whispers about McKellen's private life were swiftly extinguished. He did not parade sham fiancées on his arm, as was common in Hollywood, but he cultivated an aura of cool intellectualism, a man seemingly devoted only to Shakespeare's verse. It was a form of armor, become so formidable in your art that no one dares peer into your bedroom. Yet beneath that untouchable exterior, dissent was growing. McKellen later admitted that each time he stepped onto the stage, he felt like an imposter, because the most essential part of his humanity had been declared unacceptable. He watched colleagues stumble into scandal, saw careers collapse, and each cautionary tale drove him deeper into silence. The closet door closed tighter with every passing year. The industry was complicit in his quiet because he was too valuable an asset. He was the face of British culture, a crown jewel of international tours. An open declaration from McKellen would have threatened the polished image of an orderly, conservative Britain the establishment sold to the world. As long as he remained silent, he was a knight of the stage. Had he spoken sooner, he risked becoming a tabloid caricature overnight. Sustaining the lie required relentless discipline. He sidestepped intrusive questions, curated his social circle with care, and lived under constant tension, aware that a stray photograph or a former lover's indiscretion could undo decades of work. Then, in 1988, when Margaret Thatcher's government proposed the infamous Section 28, banning the so-called promotion of homosexuality, McKellen realized his silence had begun to feel like complicity. At 49, already acclaimed as one of the great actors of his generation, he came out live on BBC Radio. For conservative audiences, it was a thunderclap. For the industry, it was a reckoning. What astonished many was that his career did not collapse. On the contrary, it soared. The world, it seemed, was capable of accepting truth when delivered with dignity. Yet the decades spent in concealment left an indelible mark. McKellen became one of the most ardent advocates for human rights precisely because he remembered too well the taste of the lie he had swallowed each morning with his coffee. Hollywood, which for years pretended not to see its gay artists, suddenly discovered that McKellen's performances as Magneto, as Gandalf, possessed a new depth, a clarity born of authenticity rather than pretense. His story stands as an indictment of a system that forced its greatest talents to spend half their lives hiding. By stepping forward, he dismantled the facade of the flawless gentleman and proved that true greatness has nothing to do with whom you love. It rests in the courage to be yourself in a world that pays you handsomely to remain someone else. He became Gandalf not because he donned a gray hat, but because he emerged from the darkness of his own closet and carried the light of truth into an industry long clouded by hypocrisy.
Errol Flynn. If Hollywood had been asked to choose the ultimate adventurer, a man whose life off-screen was wilder than any script, it would have chosen Errol Flynn. Tall, athletic, with a defiant gaze and the trademark mustache that sealed his legend, he embodied the noble rogue, Robin Hood, Captain Blood, the perfect British officer. Audiences saw in him a symbol of daring and reckless heroism, a man who could leap from deck to deck with effortless grace, rescuing damsels in distress. Yet behind that facade of cinematic chivalry stood a figure so contradictory and potentially dangerous that intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic monitored him for years. The story of Errol Flynn is not merely one of Hollywood excess and drunken brawls. It is a shadowed maze of espionage suspicions, alleged Nazi connections, and double games the industry strained to suppress for as long as Flynn remained a fountain of revenue for Warner Bros. While moviegoers applauded his patriotic roles during the Second World War, FBI files quietly thickened, listing the national hero as a possible enemy agent using fame as a cover for gathering intelligence. The studio system crafted around Flynn the myth of the untamable Australian who loved women, wine, and danger. It was a convenient narrative. Every transgression, barroom fights, even explosive court cases involving accusations of statutory rape could be dismissed as high spirits and masculine excess. Publicists labored around the clock, transforming vice into legend. But even they could not control what Flynn did during his so-called holidays. His passion for sailing aboard his yacht, the Sirocco, provided the perfect alibi. The FBI seriously suspected that Flynn maintained close ties with Dr. Hermann Urban, an Austrian physician believed to be a Nazi agent. The two traveled together through Spain during the Civil War, and agents under J. Edgar Hoover were convinced that Flynn assisted Urban in identifying German anti-fascists fighting with the international brigades, men who might later fall into the hands of the Gestapo. The studio was aware of the rumors, yet as long as Flynn remained a gold mine, his political leanings were dismissed as the eccentricities of an artist. The industry quite literally looked the other way, even as whispers suggested that its foremost on-screen patriot might be something far darker in private life. Flynn's double existence rested on the denial of reality. He portrayed defenders of democracy, while in private conversations he was known to voice anti-Semitic views and express admiration for the strong hand of European dictators. The cynicism of it was staggering. Hollywood used his image to bolster soldiers' morale. Flynn starred in propaganda films urging young men to enlist, though he himself never entered military service, declared unfit due to a catalog of ailments, malaria, heart trouble, venereal disease, all discreetly minimized or concealed by the studio. Had the public discovered that their idol was physically frail and entangled in questionable associations with German intelligence, the house of cards at Warner Bros. Might have collapsed overnight. Instead, the myth of his steel health and impeccable patriotism endured, even as his name surfaced in intercepted communications. He was too valuable to fall, too profitable to prosecute. His life became a perpetual tightrope walk over an abyss. He deployed his charisma not only to seduce women, but to disarm investigators. Existence itself became performance art. When accusations edged too close to substance, he would throw a lavish party or plunge into another torrid affair, redirecting tabloids from espionage to scandalous romance. The studio cooperated readily. The image of a libertine was far safer for business than that of a traitor. Even after the FBI amassed hundreds of pages detailing his suspicious movements in Mexico and alleged meetings with German operatives, no formal charges followed.
Too many powerful figures in the industry had a stake in ensuring that Errol Flynn continued smiling from theater posters. He died at 50, looking 20 years older, ravaged by alcohol and drugs, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. The irony endures. A man once suspected of aiding fascists remains enshrined in cultural memory as a champion of freedom. The industry prevailed over truth, preserving for posterity the gleaming blade of Robin Hood, while locking away, in dusty archives, the troubling reports about a man who played both sides so convincingly that in the end he seemed to lose himself entirely.
Danny Kaye. If Laurence Olivier was the impregnable fortress of British dramatic art, then Danny Kaye was its opposite, a blaze of color and motion, a one-man carnival America adored for his boyish exuberance and musical brilliance. The world saw in him a wholesome entertainer, a red-haired whirlwind who could rattle off 100 words a second and coax laughter from the most stone-faced spectator. His image was spotless, devoted husband to the gifted Sylvia Fine, who wrote his greatest hits, and tireless UNICEF ambassador, embracing children across the globe. Yet behind this facade of perpetual sunshine lay one of the most guarded secrets of Hollywood's golden age, a decade-long relationship with Laurence Olivier that turned both their lives into an intricate chess match with public opinion. Kaye was not merely a friend to the great British actor, he was, in every sense but name, a hidden partner, a man for whom Olivier risked not only his reputation as a moral pillar, but the honor attached to his title. The industry knew enough to construct around them a quiet system of mutual protection, in which even their legal spouses played roles dictated by an unspoken contract. Studio executives understood that Danny Kaye was a perfect family product. His comic genius generated millions, and any blemish on his Snow White biography threatened financial disaster. When Kaye and Olivier met in New York in the 1940s, something ignited between them that defied the rigid codes of their era. It was a union of opposites, an eccentric Jewish kid from Brooklyn and the impeccably trained heir to Shakespearean tradition. Their bond unfolded across 2 continents. Whenever Kaye flew to London or Olivier arrived in Hollywood, publicity machines on both sides of the Atlantic whirred to life. Newspapers spoke of artistic collaboration and a strong male friendship, while behind the doors of hotel suites and secluded villas, a drama worthy of Shakespeare himself played out. Perhaps the most astonishing figure in this story was Sylvia Fine. She was not a naive bystander or a mere cover. She was the architect of Kaye's career and fully aware of his attachment to Olivier. Sylvia understood that in that era, truth was poison. She accepted the arrangement as part of the complicated life of a great artist, so long as he continued to shine on screen. Survival required compromise. Maintaining a double life demanded extraordinary discipline. Kaye had to embody the accessible, all-American charmer, while his heart was often thousands of miles away. Studio fixers worked tirelessly to ensure that no stray photograph, no careless remark from a waiter reached the tabloids. There were times when Olivier and Kaye vacationed together on yachts or at remote estates, guarded by discreet security cordons whose true task was to keep cameras at bay. Hollywood protected this professional alliance because both men were invaluable assets. Vivien Leigh, Olivier's wife, was also drawn into this web of silence. Her own suffering and instability were entangled with the knowledge that her husband sought solace in another man's arms. It was a fragile, painful quartet, each participant trapped within an image crafted for mass consumption. Kaye wielded his screen persona like a shield. His hyperactivity, his rapid-fire jokes and songs were a brilliant smokescreen. Who could suspect the merry clown of harboring such a forbidden and complicated private life?
The industry reinforced his saintly aura with endless charity tours and high-profile meetings with statesmen. Whenever rumors grew too persistent in certain circles, Paramount responded with glowing articles about Danny and Sylvia's extraordinary love, complete with carefully staged domestic photographs. It was an illusionist's masterpiece, hiding an elephant in a china shop so that all anyone saw was the delicate porcelain. The truth began to surface only decades after the footlights dimmed. Biographers with access to private archives pieced together the story Hollywood had buried so carefully. Danny Kaye, who sang children's songs and made the world laugh, lived with the quiet fear that his authentic self would be rejected by the very public that adored him. He was a great performer whose most important role never appeared in the credits. The industry helped him conceal his hidden partner, fashioning a gilded cage of fame and adoration in which he remained until the end, never publicly confessing that beneath the mask of the red-haired jester beat a heart worn thin by the necessity of perpetual deception. His legacy endures as bright and joyful, but the price of that serenity was paid in years of secrecy and a peculiar loneliness shared by two men, all under the watchful, unblinking eye of the studio machine.
Claudette Colbert. In Hollywood's golden age, when studio bosses trafficked in dreams and carefully packaged exoticism, Claudette Colbert was among their most refined and dependable commodities. She embodied Parisian charm, that elusive Frenchness that left American audiences enchanted. The world believed she had carried her impeccable style and flirtatious accent straight from the banks of the Seine, and her Academy Award for It Happened One Night only cemented her status as the screen's reigning foreign diva. Yet, behind the veil of chiffon and the scent of expensive perfume, stood a woman whose biography was constructed as meticulously as the lighting on her sets. Claudette Colbert was no mysterious French import. She was the product of fierce discipline and studio myth-making, which for decades concealed both her true origins and a private life that did not fit the standards of conservative America. Born Émilie Claudette Chauchouin, she moved to New York at the age of 3. By the time her career began, she was as American as apple pie. But the industry did not need another girl from the neighborhood. It required an exotic siren. Colbert accepted the challenge, turning her life into an unbroken performance of language and social reinvention. Paramount Pictures invested enormous effort in marketing her as an authentic arrival from France. A faint, carefully calibrated accent was imposed upon her, one she had to maintain in every interview and at every society function. It was an exhausting charade. A woman who thought and dreamed in English had to hesitate over words, simulating the effort of translation to sustain the illusion. But Colbert was more than an actress. She was a master of control. She quickly understood that survival in Hollywood belonged to those who managed their own image. Her obsession with perfection became legendary. She believed the right side of her face was unflattering, and for decades forbade cameras from capturing that angle. The industry obediently adapted, rearranging sets and repositioning cameras to preserve the illusion of its foremost Frenchwoman. It was a small detail, yet it mirrored her entire existence. Show the world only what has been approved. Consign everything else to shadow. The greater secret, however, was not her fabricated accent, but her personal life, concealed behind a curtain of impeccable propriety. Despite 2 official marriages, the closest relationship of her life was with Verna Hall, a woman publicly described as her secretary and companion. At the time, such arrangements were a familiar Hollywood camouflage for same-sex partnerships, a polite fiction designed to reassure the public. The studio understood the nature of their bond, yet its publicity machine functioned with clockwork precision, staging photographs of Colbert with her husbands in carefully styled domestic settings to project the image of conventional marital bliss.
Verna Hull was always present, yet always half a step behind, inhabiting the shadows as the loyal administrator. The industry protected this fragile equilibrium, fully aware that if the truth about the preferences of its icon of femininity emerged, her career would collapse overnight. Colbert lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, guarding her circle and deflecting any journalist who ventured too close. Her professionalism became her shield. She worked with mechanical precision, never late, her lines committed flawlessly to memory, a producer's dream. In return, she was forgiven much, her authority on set, her unusual contractual demands. But the cost of such perfection was immense. Claudette Colbert effectively denied herself the freedom to exist outside the brand of the French diva. Even after she left Hollywood and settled in Barbados, she maintained the cultivated persona, as though the old fiction might suddenly unravel. She was a virtuoso of illusion in an industry sustained by illusion. Her story reveals how far a person may go to meet the expectations of a system that rewards fantasy and punishes deviation. The studios helped her conceal everything, her New York childhood, her truest affections, leaving posterity with the gleaming image of a woman defined by her left profile and her Parisian charm, who never quite dared to step out of the spotlight into unvarnished reality. She died at 92, carrying most of her secrets with her. Only years later did biographers begin to assemble the fragments of truth, piecing together how difficult it must have been for Émilie Chauchuin to wake each morning and become Claudette Colbert.
Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich was not merely an actress, she was an architectural creation, built from light, shadow, and pure provocation. The world knew her as the Blue Angel, a femme fatale with a languid gaze and endless legs for whom men were supposedly ready to risk everything. In Hollywood, her image was constructed around an absolute, almost aggressive sexuality aimed squarely at male desire. Paramount, determined to craft a worthy rival to Greta Garbo, sculpted Dietrich into the perfect seductress, her supposed romances with Jean Gabin, Eric Maria Remarque, and Frank Sinatra eagerly circulated in gossip columns. The industry curated her list of male conquests with meticulous care, feeding the press tales of affairs with the era's most celebrated leading men. Yet behind this dazzling facade of heterosexual allure stood a woman far more complex and far more dangerous to the box office of her time. Marlene Dietrich lived in a world of double standards where her official status as a married woman served as a legal shield for a life threaded with passionate letters and coded declarations addressed to other women. She was a master of camouflage, turning her marriage to Rudolph Sieber into one of the longest and most successful cover operations in Hollywood history. They had married in Germany, and although their intimate relationship ended soon after the birth of their daughter, they remained legally bound until Sieber's death in 1976. For Hollywood, he was the perfect alibi. While Marlene dazzled at premieres on the arm of a new leading man, her lawful husband lived quietly elsewhere, financially supported and discreetly distant. He was her confidant, her professional husband, preserving her respectability in the eyes of conservative America. The studios were well aware that Dietrich's desires did not conform to a single script. Her appearances in trousers and tails were heralded as bold style manifestos, yet for Marlene, they were simply natural extensions of her identity. The studio capitalized on her ambiguity only so long as it remained a safe, exotic flourish. Behind closed doors, she could be attentive, even imperious, cooking for a sick lover or scrubbing a floor herself. In public, she was required to remain an untouchable deity. Over time, the gulf between myth and reality deepened. Marlene Dietrich became a captive of her own perfection. She had created a woman who did not entirely exist and was forced to feed that glamorous phantom with decades of careful deception. Her story is both a triumph of will and a quiet tragedy, the tale of someone who never fully declared to the world whom she loved.
The industry preserved her as an icon, but beneath the polished brilliance lingers the shadow of a woman who spent her life evading exposure, turning her biography into a masterpiece of mystification, where every truth was meticulously made up to resemble a more dazzling lie.
Spencer Tracy. In the history of Hollywood's golden age, Spencer Tracy occupied a place that felt almost sacred. He was called an actor's actor, the living embodiment of honesty, restraint, and steadfast decency. With his heavy jaw, piercing gaze, and shock of graying hair, he seemed born to play judges, priests, and devoted fathers, the pillars upon which American morality was said to rest. Audiences trusted every word he spoke, and MGM shaped him into an unshakable brand, the conscience of the nation. Yet behind that granite facade lay a life threaded with profound hypocrisy, sustained for 26 years by the collective will of the entire industry. Spencer Tracy was presented as a model Catholic and a faithful husband to Louise Treadwell, while in reality he spent more than a quarter of a century in a de facto marriage with Katharine Hepburn. This was not merely a private indiscretion, it was a grand conspiracy of silence, involving agents, studio executives, and even society columnists, all working to preserve the illusion of sanctity, while a far more complicated and, by the moral standards of the time, deeply sinful drama unfolded out of sight. Tracy's double life began in 1941 on the set of Woman of the Year. The spark between him and Hepburn ignited a fire that would burn until his final days. But Hollywood's iron logic quickly took hold. Tracy was a Catholic, and divorce was unthinkable, not only on religious grounds, but for the sake of his career. MGM understood that if their moral compass abandoned his wife for another woman, his image would shatter and million-dollar contracts would turn to dust. So, an unprecedented decision was made. The affair would not exist. While Tracy spent his nights at Hepburn's guest house or in rented villas far from prying eyes, official press releases continued to paint a portrait of serene domestic life with Louise and their son. It was an extraordinary feat of narrative control. Journalists saw Tracy and Hepburn dining together. Colleagues knew they were inseparable. Yet an unspoken gentleman's agreement prevailed. No photograph of them together outside a film set would appear in print. The industry constructed a protective dome around them, because the perfect Tracy was infinitely more profitable than Tracy the adulterer. For Spencer himself, the lie became a source of relentless torment, which he drowned in alcohol. His binges were notorious. The studio functioned as both guardian and janitor, retrieving him from questionable bars, paying for silence, admitting him to discreet clinics under the euphemism of exhaustion. Hepburn became his unseen guardian angel, consenting to exist in shadow to preserve his public stature. For decades, she lived according to his schedule, hid in the back seats of cars, and never demanded public recognition of their bond. Studio executives encouraged her self-sacrifice. It allowed them to exploit the electricity of their screen partnership while maintaining outward decorum. Audiences watched their chemistry unfold across 9 films, praising their artistry, unaware that what flickered on screen was not performance, but life itself. The camera was the only place they were permitted to be openly together. The cynicism reached its height in the public posture of Louise Tracy. She maintained her dignity for the sake of her husband's reputation and the future of their deaf son, becoming a silent accomplice in the great charade. The studio rewarded her silence with stability and protection from scandal. Hollywood became an enormous set stage, the facade of the happy Tracy household displayed at the front, while behind the curtain he shared his life with Katharine. When Spencer Tracy died in 1967, just weeks after completing Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the industry performed its final act of restraint. Out of respect for the official widow,
Katharine Hepburn did not attend the funeral of the man she had loved for 26 years. She waited in a car around the corner from the church while the world mourned a great family man. Only decades later, after Louise had passed away, did Hepburn speak openly, dismantling the carefully preserved fiction. Spencer Tracy entered history as a benchmark of courage and honor. The truth, however, is more complicated. He was a man imprisoned within the gilded cage of his own image, guarded so fiercely by the industry that it denied him the possibility of an honest life and, in the end, an honest farewell.
Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn entered history as Hollywood's great rebel, the woman who wore trousers when it was still a scandal and dared to dictate terms to studio executives. The world saw in her an icon of independence, a symbol of feminism and unbending will. She was called the Ice Maiden, the haughty aristocrat. Yet behind that meticulously crafted image stood a woman who for 26 years willingly held herself hostage to someone else's life and someone else's weaknesses. The tragedy of Katharine Hepburn was that her celebrated freedom was wrapped around profound self-denial. While the industry sold audiences the image of a strong woman who needed no man, behind closed doors, Katharine adjusted every breath to the schedule, illnesses, and turbulent temperament of Spencer Tracy. She did not choose a life without marriage as a manifesto of independence. She accepted it because Tracy, bound by his Catholic faith and wary of the studio's reaction, refused to divorce his legal wife. Inside Hollywood's gilded cage, Hepburn played the role of eternal companion, a presence without official photographs, without public acknowledgement, even without the right to stand openly at the coffin of the man she loved. The studio system adored the legend of Hepburn the Loner. It made her a distinct brand, set her apart from conventional starlets, and allowed executives to market her as the intellectual diva. But behind the scenes, MGM and RKO knew perfectly well that this independence was a myth. Katharine spent years pulling Tracy from depressions and prolonged drinking bouts, quietly setting aside much of her own social life and ambition so that Spence could continue to shine. She became his secretary, his nurse, his shadow. The arrangement suited the industry. As long as she remained unofficial, she remained safe. The public believed in her self-sufficiency, while publicists carefully erased from her biography any hint that the strong woman on screen endured the humiliating status of a permanent second wife. It was one of the era's greatest hypocrisies. Hollywood promoted Hepburn as progressive while compelling her to slip into the back seat of cars to avoid scandal that might damage the profits of their joint films. Maintaining this double existence required nerves of steel. Hepburn perfected a strategy of distance from the press, wielding her reputation for bluntness as a shield. If a journalist edged too close to her private life, she cut the exchange short with a sharp remark, and the industry framed it as evidence of her fierce independence. In truth, it was a defensive wall. Katharine understood that the slightest crack in their secrecy could destroy Tracy's career, a career she valued more than her own. She became the architect of her confinement, consenting to a role that contradicted everything she proclaimed on screen. The bitterest moment of this long deception came at the end. When Spencer died, Katharine phoned his wife Louise and offered friendship. The answer was cold refusal. She was not permitted to attend the funeral. The industry that had profited for decades from their chemistry turned away without hesitation, observing the decorum that protected reputations. After Tracy's death, Hepburn performed one final and masterful act of myth-making. She gathered the fragments of her secret life and reshaped them into a grand declaration. She began speaking openly of her love, framing years of compromise as the highest form of devotion and spiritual freedom.
She convinced the world that her hidden life had been a conscious choice, a testament to a love that needed no marriage certificate. The world accepted it, eager for a beautiful legend about a woman above convention. But the fuller truth lingered in shadow. Katharine Hepburn spent a quarter of a century in perpetual waiting, fearing exposure, and living in the shadow of a man who never found the courage to make her an official part of his life. She died at 96, leaving behind 4 Academy Awards and the image of the freest woman in the world. Yet in reality, she was one of the system's most faithful captives, a woman who learned to transform private pain into a flawless Hollywood script.
The story of 11 stars of the old British school and the Hollywood titans who stood beside them is not merely a collection of tantalizing gossip. It is a stern indictment of an era in which human sincerity was treated as defective merchandise. We have seen how the glittering facade of the so-called Golden Age was erected upon a foundation of fear, renunciation, and collective complicity, where studio bosses reigned as omnipotent puppet masters and actors lived as hostages to their own success. Cary Grant, who erased his past, Laurence Olivier and Kaye, who concealed their love behind the scenery of respectability, Vivien Leigh, whose madness was converted into box-office revenue, Merle Oberon, forced to betray her own mother in pursuit of the correct shade of skin. Each of them moved along the vast conveyor belt of illusion. The industry did not merely assist in hiding the truth, it compelled the lie, fully aware that audiences were purchasing not talent, but the promise of a flawless myth. These extraordinary artists paid for their screen immortality with years of solitude, paranoia, and inner division. In a world where image cost more than life itself, the most difficult role was the role of one's own authentic self. Their brilliance dazzled millions, yet behind the curtain stood individuals split between who they were and who they were required to be. Now, with the mothballs shaken from the skeletons in the closet, the shining icons appear less like untouchable idols and more like living, wounded human beings. Their deepest tragedy was not scandal, nor secret passion, nor political misjudgment. It was that their real lives were censored out of existence. Old Hollywood remains in history as a glittering golden cage, where the price of admission was the surrender of identity, and the right to tell the truth was granted only after death.